The proceeding will start shortly. 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 . The proceeding will start shortly. . The proceeding will start shortly. . The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, and welcome to this summer session of the Liaison Committee, and welcome to the Prime Minister who is giving us evidence today. I've noted, Prime Minister, that we have been informed you have an engagement immediately after this session, so we are aiming to end on the dot of 3:30. You're usually very generous with a bit of extra time, but we'll let you off today. Thank you very much for what you usually do for us. We've slightly altered the order because Sir Bob Neal has to speak in the Estimates Day debate. So we will take him first, and he will be referring to the fact that the Liaison Committee itself has launched an inquiry to explore Select Committee scrutiny of strategic thinking across government, with which I can assure you that the civil service and ministers are already well engaged, and we look forward to that being a positive inquiry. Sir Bob Neal.
Thank you very much, Sir Bernard. Prime Minister, I was tempted to say I'm opening the bowling, but maybe that's not the appropriate start for today. But I wanted to refer to the inquiry that the Liaison Committee has set up, because we attempt, after all, to coordinate the activity of all the select committees. And the purpose of the inquiry is to look at the way government seeks to coordinate policy and decisions and action across government departments. Do you recognise that there is a problem with the UK government activities being very siloed?
Well, I think that has historically been a concern of government. I mean, I saw that as Chancellor, actually, probably most acutely when I was doing spending reviews. where obviously departments would focus on the things that were most important to them, and some of those areas that required departments to work together to put in bids were probably less developed than you might like. Actually, the early years being an obvious example of that. So, I mean, I can certainly see why the perception is there, and as I said, I've seen most developments of that as Chancellor.
Can I draw the position of the Ministry of Justice to your attention as an example of this, as a department whose funding is not protected in financial terms, but which is frequently under pressure because of failures in other parts of the system. For example, people end up in the justice system because they've had chaotic lifestyles. Families are broken up. They've been failed by social services. They've been failed at school. They've been failed by drug testing programmes. What is the means whereby government can take into account the pressures that are placed upon that downstream department, which is the recipient of the failures elsewhere? Is there a mechanism to recognise that and to join up policy across those areas?
Yes, so actually when I was Chancellor we established something called the Shared Outcomes Fund, which funded departments to do exactly this, to work together, particularly where they could tackle some of the problems that need upstream or downstream, depending on your perspective, intervention. As early years as one I mentioned, where actually the Supporting Families programme, what used to be called the Troubled Families programme, is a good example of that, where work was done to evaluate the benefit of that programme on outcomes in education or the criminal justice system, so that government overall could understand the value of that programme. It shouldn't just be something that MHCLG or DLUC should be concerned with, because actually all these departments were benefiting one way or another from that programme. So that's the type of thinking that I try to introduce as Chancellor, and I think that programme is a good example where there was clear evidence that it was having an impact beneficially on criminal justice outcomes.
Two quick examples. The Home Office is recruiting 20,000 extra police officers. That's government policy. What steps are being taken to properly fund the Ministry of Justice for the extra court time that will be taken up by hopefully those police officers capturing more offenders and potential prison time? Because at the moment they are not covered to pick up the costs of those extra police officers doing their job.
So, I mean, actually my recollection, because I was Chancellor at the time that the funding for that was put in place, was that the downstream impact of the 20,000 police officers were calculated and funded as part of the original settlement for all those departments to deliver on the 20,000 police officers commitment. I was Chancellor at the time, and I distinctly remember those conversations and that modelling happening, with particular focus on the downstream cost, because you're absolutely right, we can't just focus on the cost of the police officers. Obviously that has a knock-on impact elsewhere. But my recollection is that was funded as part of the settlement at the time for the 20,000 police officers uplift programme.
To try and join up matters, at least within the criminal justice world, there was something called the Criminal Justice Board that was established back in 2015. It hasn't actually met since 2021, but it still appears in existence on the government website. Got an excellent Lord Chancellor. Could you perhaps assist him to get that Criminal Justice Board up and operating again, because there's a real concern of a lack of join-up across this sector?
So I'm very happy to make sure that the join-up is happening, and actually for example, on tackling illegal migration, that's something where I regularly convene different departments, particularly Home Office and Ministry of Justice, because it requires, and indeed actually DLUC and others, because it requires a cross-government coordination to deliver on the priorities. And I'll happily look at making sure that we are coordinated and joined up. I'm not sure what the exact right structure is sitting here, but I very much am sympathetic to the thrust of the question.
Just a potential cost savings if we can get it right.
And again, which is to the benefit of the individuals and indeed the taxpayer, where we can realise those.
And the final point I was going to raise, Sir Bernard, very quickly, is this. You've recognised in the past, Prime Minister, the importance of the reputation of the English legal system for the United Kingdom's standing in the world. In October, England and Wales will have its first woman Chief Justice. Will you make a point of making an early opportunity to meet with Dame Sue Carr when she takes up her appointment, so you can learn from her firsthand the real pressures that there are on the courts? Because delays of 2 years or so for a small business to have a money claim that can make all the difference to its survival, heard in the county courts, for example, are really not acceptable or fair. Would you agree?
Yeah, so actually met already with the previous Lord Chief Justice, I think a couple of different times since I've been Prime Minister, and I fully expect that I will continue those meetings and engagement with the new Lord Chief Justice. And we are focused very hard on reducing the court backlog. Obviously, more funding has gone into it, as the committee will be aware, but also we've removed the limit on sitting days in the Crown Court. We've continued to use the, I believe, 16 Nightingale courtrooms, and actually we raised the statutory retirement age for judicial office holders, all of which are initiatives that help expand judicial capacity to help us get through the backlogs. But it remains a commitment and a focus of ours, but I look forward to discussing that with the new Lord Chief Justice in due course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Bob. We're now moving on to the all-important subject of the Russian aggression in Ukraine and other associated security issues, with Alicia Cairns, Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Thank you, Chair. Prime Minister, I fear that we are on the cusp of the Gaza crisis of 2023. Yesterday we took up presidency of the UN Security Council. How do you hope that over this month we will use that to shed a light on what is taking place, but also what outcomes will we achieve during our presidency?
So what were you referring specifically to, Alicia?
So the Gaza crisis, so essentially Israel-Palestine, but also as President of the UN Security Council over the next month, what have you tasked Foreign Office civil servants to achieve?
Well, I think there's a couple of different things. Obviously, with regard to the current situation in Israel and around, of course we support Israel's right to self-defense and have condemned the recent terrorist attacks. We would say that the protection of civilians must be prioritised in any military operation, and would urge the IDF to demonstrate restraint in its operation and for all parties to avoid further escalation in both the West Bank and Gaza, both now and in the days ahead, and also call on Israel to adhere to principles of necessity and proportionality when defending their legitimate security interests. More broadly, with regard to the UN Security Council and our actions there, I would imagine that we will continue to focus on highlighting what's happening in Ukraine, Russia's illegal invasion. I think one thing that we have helped, I think, play a leading role in is ensuring broad support at the UN condemning Russian action. Over 140 different countries have signed the resolutions that we have helped to support in the UN, and that will continue, I would imagine, to be a focus in the coming weeks and months. And I think recent events in Russia highlight from others the illegality of Russia's invasion, and I think hopefully other countries are recognising that and will continue to use the UN as a platform to highlight that.
So just before we move on to Ukraine, in your discussions with Netanyahu, how clear were we that we should not see an expansion of illegal settlements, and will we see Israel-Palestine brought forward specifically by the British government then over the next month?
So settlements are illegal under international law, and we've said that they present an obstacle to peace and threaten the physical viability of a two-state solution. We've consistently engaged with Israel, and obviously I met President Netanyahu a little while ago, and we've repeatedly made clear to Israel that we oppose any settlement expansion, and we've asked the Israeli government to halt and reverse its policy.
And moving then to Ukraine, there are reports that ahead of the Vilnius summit, I guess a coalition of the willing will bring forward some sort of security support package, a security agreement for Ukraine. Can you set out for me what your vision would be for such a security agreement for Ukraine?
Well, not wanting to preempt the conversations that are obviously happening in private, what I have said is that I think it would be beneficial for Ukraine and for the conflict for there to be a multilateral declaration of support for Ukraine into the long term. There are various different shapes and forms that can take. Those conversations are happening. The purpose of that declaration, assuming it can be something that gathers broad support, is to demonstrate that support for Ukraine will be in place for the long term. I think that will send a strong signal to Putin that his efforts are in vain, and ultimately he should recognise that we, the coalition of the willing who are defending principles of territorial integrity in the UN Charter, are not going to go away and will continue to give Ukraine the support it needs and the means to defend itself against current and future aggression. But so those conversations are ongoing.
And what's your level of confidence that at Vilnius we will see a path to NATO membership for Ukraine set out and agreed?
Again, those conversations are ongoing. As you all know, NATO is a consensus organisation, and so we're having those conversations with our partners. You know, what's very clear, I've said previously in the past that Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO, but the alliance works by consensus, so we will have to work together with our allies. But there are things that we are already doing that will help Ukraine on that journey, notably increasing the interoperability of capabilities, the training of Ukrainian troops to NATO standards, and the provision of NATO standard equipment. All are examples of that type of support that will help Ukraine not just now, but on that longer term journey as well.
Thank you. Moving us to the Balkans, there has been an international failure of deterrence when it comes to the Western Balkans. I think that's best exemplified by the EU and US response and recent punishments of Kosovo in the face of Serb antagonism and Dodik secessionist rhetorics in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As Prime Minister, will you now commit that we will rejoin U4, which I'd add that both Turkey and Chile are members of? And will you also consider lobbying for an expansion of KFOR's mandate in Kosovo so that they can deal with the illegal arms being brought across from Serbia into Kosovo, which are arming illegal Belgrade-funded and armed militias in Kosovo?
Well, first thing to say is we in the government fully support Bosnia and Herzegovina's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and will continue to take measures against those who threaten that. I'm particularly concerned about the situation in the north of Kosovo, which you'll be familiar with, and very much condemn the unprovoked attacks by protesters on KFOR personnel. The Foreign Secretary has already told the Prime Ministers of both Kosovo and Serbia that leaders in Belgrade and Pristina do have a responsibility to reduce tension and prevent further violence. Our view is we must find a way back to the EU-facilitated dialogue. With regard to EU4, we do see EU4 as vital for peace and security in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and our non-participation in it doesn't reflect the importance of the operation to the peace and stability of the region, and we're going to continue to explore opportunities to widen cooperation with the mission.
Thank you. I would urge the government to look very close at that, and then very briefly, just taking back to Israel-Palestine, just a yes or no answer. Would you now put in place a special envoy for the Middle East peace process to make sure we have the adequate attention on what's going on there?
I think, look, it's something that I know the FCDO are talking to the Honourable Lady about, and happy to continue talking to her about. We continue to say that's something that we'll be open to at a time that we think it will be beneficial to the peace process. So it's not that we're against it in principle, it's just figuring out when it can
I'm going to take that as a yes, but subject to announcement, hopefully. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Prime Minister, I'm not using my time in this session for the benefit of others, but two supplementaries very briefly. We're confronting Russian aggression in Ukraine very vociferously and very clearly. How confident are you that the international community is not appeasing proxy Russian aggression in the Balkans?
I don't believe that we are, and as I've heard from my answers to Alicia, we're continuing to take quite a robust stance against proxies, not just in that region, but previously in Africa as well with Wagner, because where we see threats to territorial integrity and sovereignty, I think it's important that we do our best to stand up for them, and that's what we're doing.
And the war in Ukraine will last as long as the friends of democracy around the world allow it to last. The more support we can give, the quicker it will end successfully for the Ukrainians. Are we doing enough, and what more could we be doing?
Well, we've, I think as everybody knows, providing £2.3 billion in military support for Ukraine this year, matching what we've given last year, which I believe puts us second only to the Americans. But I think it's more, as well as just the quantum of support, it's a type of support where we have been consistently out in front in the type of capability that we are providing to the Ukrainians and training them on. That you saw that with main battle tanks, which I was the first leader to announce we would provide, and then most recently with Storm Shadow long-range weapons, which are having a beneficial impact on the current state of the conflict. And we will continue to do that, look for opportunities to provide Ukrainians with the support they need. The priority remains, as it always has been, heavy armour, artillery, long-range weapons and training, most recently combat air, where we will play our part as part of an international coalition to provide combat capabilities, particularly training of pilots, and we're starting that this summer. In fact, which is something that I know the Ukrainians have warmly welcomed. And we continue to talk to other countries about increasing their support for Ukraine, both in quantum and in capability. And I think that is important at this stage, because the priority is to ensure that the counteroffensive can be as successful as we would all like it to be.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Greg Clark on science and technology and AI.
Thank you, Sir Bernard. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Prime Minister, a few days ago you told London Tech Week that the possibilities of AI are extraordinary. What do you see as the biggest positive impact of artificial intelligence?
Well, I think just in the last few weeks in the news reporting, you've seen some of the promise of AI, paralysed people being able to walk, the kind of cracking of the structure of almost every known protein, and starting to be able to model reactions in nuclear fusion. So it just gives you a sense of the variety that is there. And also when you combine that with the computational power of quantum, I think you can really start to imagine a future in which even incurable diseases like cancer and dementia or new ways to grow crops all might be possible. Look, for me, I'd kind of put it in a couple of different categories. I think straightforwardly on the economy side, an interesting report from PwC recently that estimated a kind of 10% GDP benefit over the coming decade. You're starting to see that in the way that companies are using AI, and indeed leading companies like Palantir opening their European AI HQ here, and the quality of our research, etc. So that's on the economic side. And I've spoken in the past about AI holding out the promise of being a general purpose technology, and the economic research is very clear that that leads to a kind of J-curve effect in productivity that we are on the cusp of hopefully realising. And then in public services, I'd say health and education are the two areas where I'm excited, particularly in healthcare. I think people are reasonably familiar with the opportunity to speed up diagnosis of a range of different conditions, but also improve the productivity and accuracy of, for example, people looking for skin cancers. There's interesting derm AI technology that is being deployed, or robotic surgery. And then in education, the opportunity to reduce workload for teachers, whether it's lesson planning or marking, but then also provide personalised tuition for children. The Khan Academy is starting to roll out an AI chatbot, which has, I think, enormous potential, because we know that more personalised approach to learning has huge benefits for children, particularly disadvantaged children. And tutoring in the physical sense is hard to scale, but the technology allows us to provide that, and I think that would be transformational.
Absolutely. So lots of upsides. But in that speech to London Tech Week, you said that we must do AI safely. So what do you see as the biggest danger of AI?
So I would categorise the risks into a few different buckets. I think first, there's the socioeconomic risk from the large-scale societal shifts that the technology will bring. That's often what technology does. That doesn't mean you should stand in the way of it, but it just needs to make sure that we're cognizant of it and provide people with the skills they need to flourish in a world that is being changed by technology. I think the second is the risk of misuse, and that is whether it's open source models or otherwise, the ability that they can be used as tools to generate misinformation or identify and exploit cyber vulnerabilities or create harmful content or deep fakes or child sexual abuse. That's the kind of second category. I think the third category would be tool use, whereby foundation models can be used to activate capabilities in the real world. And then the last category is what people would describe as capability overhangs, and that kind of trends into the area of more existential risk, because there's just a lack of understanding at this point about what the potential of these models might be. Now, obviously separate to all of that, there are national security risks, which I'm sure the Honourable Gentleman acknowledge. I appreciate I'm limited in what I can say, but I think thinking about it in those four categories is probably the right way to go about it.
Thank you. And you've convened an international safety summit for the autumn. Are you intending that to be a summit of like-minded countries like the US and Japan, perhaps? Or is it for all countries, a bit like the International Atomic Energy Authority that includes countries like China and Russia? What do you have in mind?
I think, look, I think in the first instance, mainly what we're trying to do is acknowledge that there is a global dimension to this challenge. And AI doesn't respect national borders. Countries are at varying stages of their thinking about how we can put guardrails in place to make sure that we can realise the benefits of AI in a way that's safe and secure, and it seems a sensible and reasonable step to just try and bring some of those countries together to talk about these problems in a collective forum, because ultimately there will need to be some coordination.
Sure.
So I think it's quite early thinking. As I said, it's more just about bringing people together.
So all countries together?
Well, it's just bringing people together who are thinking about these things in a similar way, to exchange ideas, share information, as I said, because AI doesn't respect national borders, and I think we will all benefit from hearing and talking to each other in a conversation with the businesses themselves. And I think that is really what this is about. I think we're a long way from anyone establishing a AIA, IAA equivalent for AI. Those things are long into the distance, but in the first instance, just talking through this with like-minded countries seems a sensible
finally
next step.
from that, Prime Minister, you've got this summit, you published a white paper in March. The last session of this Parliament begins in November. Do you expect there to be an AI bill in the King's speech?
I'm not going to comment now on fourth session legislation. All those conversations are happening and no final decisions are being made. I think actually what we need to do, and I think probably we can do lots of this without legislation, is sitting down and figuring out what are the safety features and guardrails that we'd like to put in place. And I think we have a sense of what some of those might be, whether it's watermarking, whether it's pre-release information sharing, whether it's reporting and licensing of large training runs, whether it's pre-training or pre-deployment disclosure, transparency on the data sets that are used. I think that's the kind of category of things that we need to spend time on, which is why the Foundation Model Task Force has been set up and funded specifically in its early phase to focus on safety research. I think it's an area where the UK can lead because we already have good capability in it. So if we can develop that capability further, because it's a growing field, it will mean that we will know what to do. And it may well be, and actually so far, the conversations with the three leading foundation model companies have been incredibly cooperative.
But they're calling for legislation.
I think what they want are for governments to put in place the guardrails, and they're very open about that, and they're very, I say thus far, they have been incredibly constructive and open and transparent with government, and want to try and find a solution together, which, as I said, it's too early to preempt what all that might look like, but you can imagine a world where at least the initial stages of that don't require legislation necessarily, but actually just require us to get in there and do safety evaluation on the models and have access to them. And as I said, we've had announcements already from some of those foundation model companies that they will provide that access to the government to be able to do that on a priority basis, which I'm grateful for and I think will help us get this right.
Thank you, Promise.
I'm sorry, we're dragging behind. People are going to have to be quicker and I'll have to be stricter. Dame Diana Johnson, Home Affairs.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. I know you're appealing the Court of Appeal's ruling on the Rwanda scheme. You've said this policy is an important part of your plan to tackle illegal migration and stop small boats. So do you have a plan for what you'll do if the appeal fails?
As I said, our belief remains that the plan that we have is legal, it's compliant with all our obligations, and we'll be appealing it vigorously. And if you look at the ruling, what you'll see is the Lord Chief Justice, in his opinion, agreed with the High Court and with the government that the safeguards and reassurances that we have received from Rwanda are sufficient. There's a very specific point of contention about the onward relocation, potentially, of people who we send to Rwanda. And so we believe that the safeguards we have are sufficient, so we'll continue to confidently and vigorously pursue our case.
So you're betting everything on the Rwanda policy being upheld in the Supreme Court?
Well, no, it's not. I think that's not a fair characterisation of what we're doing.
Well, it's a gamble, isn't it? You're not sure.
Last year and indeed this year, I set out a range of things that we're doing to tackle this problem.
Yes.
So, for example...
Can I come on to that? Because I've got some specific questions of what you're going to say.
Just answer because you answered the question. It could be a very substantive additional piece is the new deal that we have with Albania.
Yeah,
Albania
with the greatest respect, Prime Minister, I've got very little time and I do want to get through some important issues with you. So if I could just leave that, I've got your.
But I think you made
response.
A statement that we're betting the house on one thing. I think it's reasonable for me to say, well, let me give you an example of something else that is significant, that is making a difference to the problem.
With the greatest respect, Prime Minister, I've got quite a few questions I want to ask. So you're clear that you think Rwanda's going to succeed in the Supreme Court. Just on the small boats issue, I think it's 6 months today since you made your 5 promises to the British people, including stopping the small boats. Now, win or lose in the Supreme Court, right now, your plans around Rwanda are on hold. So does that mean your attempt to stop the small boats, that's on hold at the moment?
No, and a good example of why it's not on hold is our deal with Albania. Albania accounted for 1/3 of illegal migrants that crossed last year. We looked at, and that is surprising given that Albania is clearly a safe country and it's an ally, European nation, and it's a signatory to many of the same treaties that we are on these issues, which is why our new deal with Albania and a revision in how we treat illegal migrants from Albania means...
I know you're very keen to talk about Albania, but I'm very keen to actually address the fact that in June...
Well,
so
it's
actually
you asked for an example of being committed to continuing to stop the boats outside of the Rwanda policy. This is a very good example of something that, as I said, we've returned almost 2,000 illegal migrants.
But none from actually who came across last year. None of the returns actually relate to people who travelled in small boats last year, do they?
Because we work through the backlog of people we've got. But because of the new deal, we are now able to return people to Albania, and you can start to see the early benefit of that deterrence because in the most recent data that we had, the number of illegal migrants from Albania had reduced considerably since we put that new deal in place.
Okay, let's move on from Albania.
It shows that you can make a difference on this policy.
The largest number of people who crossed the Channel in small boats last year, the largest number in any of the records that have been kept over the last 5 years, 3,824. The majority come, or a large chunk come from Afghanistan. So what I'm just trying to get to is with the rate of progress that you're making at the moment, when do you think you'll be able to fulfil your pledge to stop the small boats?
So obviously the court will have to determine its own ruling, and that is outside of the government's hands. It's the court that determines the timing of its rulings. But in the meantime, we can get on with a range of other things, as I said. We've talked about the deal in Albania. The other thing, one of the other things we're doing...
You've talked about the deal in Albania quite a lot.
Actually, we'll move on to one of the other things we're doing is tackling illegal working to show people that if they do come here illegally, they won't be able to disappear into the black economy. So one of the things we've done is increase the number of illegal working raids by about 50%.
Can I just ask you some questions that relate...
And again, all of that will contribute, I believe, to a deterrent effect.
Okay. With the greatest respect, Prime Minister, I want to ask you this. The illegal migration bill, which was introduced earlier this year, since the bill was introduced, 8,128 people have crossed the Channel in small boats. So if we assume your Rwanda policy is upheld in the Supreme Court, Rwanda has said they can take a capacity of 500 people. So that leaves 7,628 who've come across since the bill was introduced. What do you intend will happen to those people?
As I said, I'm not going to talk about a private commercial contract that we have, but our Rwanda scheme, as we have said multiple times, is uncapped.
Okay.
So I think
that's
that is
not what
important.
The Rwandans say, is it?
Well, the Rwanda scheme is uncapped, and which is why I believe it can act as a very helpful deterrent when the scheme is up and running.
Can I move on to your other promise, which is around dealing with the backlog? And when you came last time, you said you were going to double the workforce, triple productivity, and re-engineer the system to deal with the backlog, the legacy backlog. Yet the National Audit Office has found the Home Office is not yet making enough decisions to actually achieve your target of clearing that part of the backlog by December 23. So I just wondered what's going wrong, because you were very chipper last time about how you were going to deliver this.
Yes, so I think when I made the announcement, the legacy initial asylum backlog was around 92,000. When I gave the update earlier this year, that had reduced by almost a fifth, by about 17,000 down to around 74,000. So that is the progress that has already been made in reducing the legacy initial asylum backlog. And I said that those numbers were when I last gave the update, but they were down by around a fifth.
So you'll deliver by December?
Your time's up. Sorry. Moving on to the cost of living crisis, Harriet Baldwin for the Treasury Committee.
Thank you very much, Sir Bernard. Now, Prime Minister, we're halfway through the year and you want to halve inflation this year. And how is that going? What probability would you assign to you achieving that by the end of the year?
Well, I'll leave that to the forecasters, but we remain committed to bringing inflation down. And halfway is a step on it going back down to the inflation target, which is obviously even lower than that. And now it's clearly inflation proving more persistent than people anticipated, but that doesn't mean that the plans and the policy options that have been deployed are the wrong ones. Indeed, they're the right ones, whether that's monetary policy, responsible fiscal policy, or supply-side reform. You know, that's the right toolkit that you need to deploy at bringing inflation down. We just need to continue to stick to the course, and that's not easy. That involves difficult decisions, but those are the right long-term decisions for the country, because if we don't do that, inflation will just get worse and last for longer, and that doesn't help anybody.
You've mentioned forecasts, and the Bank of England, the Chair of Court, has actually written to the Treasury Committee to say that they're going to do a root and branch review of their inflation forecasting models because they have been wrong. So what percentage would you put on achieving your goal of halving inflation?
I don't have one for you. I'm working 100% to deliver it, and we will keep doing that. That's all I can do, is just keep throwing everything at it. And as I said, the broad mix of policy levers we have of the monetary policy, which is independent of government, fiscal policy, which is in our control, and supply-side reform. Those are the two levers that we have that we will make sure that we use fully. And I think everyone can see that this is incredibly important, and it's important that we tackle it, because that's ultimately what is making people poorer. It's eating into the money in their pockets, and that's why defeating inflation is such a central premise and plank of our economic strategy.
Do you accept that there's a higher probability as of today that you will miss that target than there was at the beginning of the year?
I think there's a range of forecasts, but I don't spend my time on that. I can't control. What I can control is what we're doing, and what I can tell you is we remain committed to bringing inflation down and using all the tools at our disposal to keep working to bring inflation down. Right? That's what I should focus on, and that's what the government is going to continue to do.
And given that the Bank of England have accepted they need to look again at their inflation models, do you have confidence in the approach that they're taking to bring inflation down?
Yes, of course I support the Bank of England. I mean, look, their modelling is a matter for them, and it's right that they're having that dialogue and evaluating everything that they do. But of course I support the Bank of England. The track record of the independent central bank over the past 20-25 years at keeping inflation to target has been very strong. I don't think anyone thinks we should return to a world where the government is setting interest rates. So I think it is right that they're set independently. Again, it's not easy that we bring. There are no decisions that are easy when it comes to bringing inflation down, but we have to do the things that are right for the long-term benefit of the country.
You're confident that the tools that they're using are the right one, because obviously they keep raising bank rate, and that's affecting mortgage payers in particular. And actually a small cohort of mortgage payers who are either on a variable or whose fixed rates are coming to an end. So it's a really small subset of the population that are having to do the heavy lifting in terms of reducing demand through this monetary policy tool. Is there nothing that could be done that might sort of widen the fiscal pain, as it were, that would make it less of a problem that the Bank of England could only solve through raising rates much more sharply than they had anticipated?
So again, it wouldn't be right for me to comment on monetary policy, but there are lots of different transmission mechanisms for how monetary policy feeds into the real economy. Obviously, mortgage rates are one, but there are other ways as well. You're right about the transmission mechanism being perhaps slower when it comes to mortgages than it has been in the past because of the preponderance of people to have at least short-term fixed-rate mortgages now, but that's something that the bank take into account in their modelling. But as I say, the mortgage aspect of it is just one of the many transmission mechanisms of the monetary policy. What else can we do? Well, that's what I talked earlier about fiscal policy and supply-side reform. So fiscal policy is making sure that our borrowing is responsible, our approach to public sector pay is responsible. If we get those things wrong, that makes the inflation situation worse. And with supply-side reform, it's about making sure that we are increasing the supply of areas of the economy where we are short. That's fundamentally leading to some of the inflationary pressures. So whether that's in energy, labour markets, or elsewhere, I think we should target our policy there. And look, of course, I acknowledge the difficulty that rising interest rates pose for mortgage holders.
And may I just use my last half minute to ask about savers and the transmission mechanism of them being paid more by the banks? Do you endorse the campaign that the Treasury Committee's had on that?
Look, I endorse what the Chancellor said, that the issue needs to be resolved. I know he's met recently with the FCA and they've agreed to deliver better deals for savers by driving competition and increasing reporting, which I think they're doing in the next few weeks in particular to make sure that savers are benefiting from higher interest rates. So I fully support the FCA's review, and indeed the new consumer duty gives them a stronger power to take action if necessary. And alongside that, the Charter for mortgage holders provides support and relief for mortgage holders that are facing difficulty with repayments, allowing them to either stretch the term of their mortgages or switch to interest-only payments. Either or both of those can save people hundreds of pounds a month potentially on their mortgage bill when it reprices, but also they can do that without any impact on their credit rating. And there is also the support for mortgage interest scheme for more vulnerable borrowers, which has been increased in generosity and accessibility. So those are the different things that
Thank you.
are
Moving
there to help
on,
people.
Clive Betts for Department for the Housing and Communities and Levelling Up Committee.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. I'm sure we can all agree that there's a real problem in this country, both the rising housing costs and a shortage of housing, which affects the whole country, but some families in particular. And therefore, it is important that the government achieves its target of building 300,000 new homes a year. I presume that is still the government's target. But at the end of the year, you consulted on, through planning policy, of abolishing local housing targets that councils have to meet. So when you get back to the office and get out your spreadsheets and you look at the 300,000 target at the bottom, which the nation has to hit, how can that be done if the government's going to give up its influence over the individual targets in each local area that are supposed to add up to that 300,000?
Well, what I would say is we had a commitment to deliver 1 million homes over the Parliament, which we're continuing to make progress towards. I think in the last year that we have numbers for, ending 2022, something like 230,000 additional homes were delivered, which in and itself was the third highest yearly rate, I think, in the last 3 decades. And indeed, if you look at the last few years, all of them have been in some of the highest rates we've seen for decades. So I think that shows that the government's policies are delivering, and we're making progress to our overall ambition of 1 million homes over the Parliament. And with regard to the planning reforms, I think it's important that the planning system also has the confidence in the community. Targets remain there, but they're a starting point as opposed to something that's being imposed on communities without reference
but how is
to
the
the
government going to
particular
achieve the
circumstances.
300,000, Prime Minister, if you're losing control of the individual figures that add up to it? I mean, Litchfield's, the planning consultancy, have said that this planning policy in consultation is going to reduce house building to 150,000 a year, half the government's target. Already this year, housing starts have fallen by 12% from a figure that was well below the 300,000 to begin with. That's not success, is it?
Well, I think what is success is, as I said, we've delivered some of the highest years of new housing additions in 3 decades over the last few years. So I think that shows the approach is working. And what we are doing as well is ensuring that we support local communities to bring housing on stream, particularly on brownfield land, where we're investing taxpayer funds to help remediate land and unlock.
Are you effectively
thousands
giving
of
local
homes.
communities a veto then over achieving the 300,000?
No, it's as I said, what we're doing is we are reforming how the planning system works so that we strengthen the neighbourhood plans, which actually, particularly neighbourhood plans, have shown that they can deliver the housing that people need in their local areas, but they do so in a way that has the consent of the community, which is important. And it means that the character of local areas and the particular circumstances in each local area, whether it's greenbelt or something else, are taken into account in assessing what is a reasonable amount of housing to deliver.
How that's going to get us to 70,000 more homes when you're taking away the ability to influence targets. Can I just go on to one other point, Prime Minister? Many people, because they can't afford a home, there's no social housing to rent, end up in the private rented sector, sometimes through choice, often because that's the only place for them to go. Since 2020, the local housing allowance, which helps the poorest families pay for the rent in the private rented sector, has been frozen. Yet at the same time, rents in the private rented sector have risen by 25%. There's now only 1 in 20 homes that are covered by the local housing allowance. How is it fair for government policy to impact so severely on the poorest families who no longer can pay for the rent of most homes in the private rented sector with the allowances that are available to them?
So, look, I can't remember precisely, but I think we increased the local housing allowance a couple of years ago by a very significant amount. I thought
frozen since 2020, Prime Minister.
Yeah, but it frozen at a level that was significantly higher than it was before, whereas about a £600 uplift to, from memory, about 1.5 million
doesn't help families with a 25% rent increase they can't pay for.
So, and actually there's the discretionary housing payments of a few £100 million that are there to support people as well, as on top of housing benefit. And the Affordable Homes Programme has delivered thousands of new affordable homes for rent, and will continue to do so as well.
But affordable homes are 80% of market rents, Prime Minister. They're not affordable to most people, are they, on the lowest income?
I look at it, it's a question of how you're targeting that support, but as I said, the Affordable Homes Programme, I think it's over £11 billion over its period. It's significantly higher than the one that it replaced. It's supporting thousands of new affordable homes for rent, together with housing benefit, discretionary housing payments. All that support is there.
But even public service workers, nurses, policemen and others can't afford affordable rents in London, can they? 80% of market rents are just not within the remit of many public service workers struggling on their current levels of pay.
Yes, which is why on the other side we've taken huge steps to help people with their energy bills, which is saving them around £1,500 over the past few months, raising the national living wage by record levels to put more money in their pockets, raising the threshold at which people start paying national insurance. All of those things also put more money in people's pockets.
I think a lot of people will think, Prime Minister, you're not really on their side.
Order.
Well, I think if you actually look at you can look at the case studies of families in different circumstances, and what you'll see is, because of the support we've put in place, it is actually disproportionately benefiting the most vulnerable families. Now, that's happening in lots of different ways, whether it's support with energy bills, the cost of living payments that are worth £900 that are going to several million of the most vulnerable households in our society this year, whether it's a national living wage increase or the tax changes. All of those add up to quite meaningful support for families, deliberately targeted on the most vulnerable families.
Moving on, Catherine McKennell for the Petitions Committee.
Thank you. But it's not working, is it, Prime Minister? Do you take responsibility for the fact the UK has the highest inflation in the G7 and the lowest growth projections?
So I think we've had this debate in the past, and if you look at the growth projections, actually we were the fastest growing country in the G7.
I asked a very specific question. No, I asked a very specific
22.
question, which is, do you take responsibility for it?
Of course, I take responsibility for the government. But I think just to correct what you're saying, I think it's important. As actually the head of the IMF.
No, sorry. Do you dispute those facts? We have the highest inflation rate in the G7 and the lowest. Well, no, I'm just asking if he disputes the facts, because there's no point in giving a 2-minute answer.
I'm putting them in context because it's important. As the head of the IMF themselves says, because those are the numbers that you are quoting. The head of the IMF themselves said at a press conference here in the UK, which I'm sure the Honourable Lady was listening to, she's quoting the figures, that it is actually not right to focus on one specific year when it comes to growth forecasts. And actually, if you look at any period, either the 2 years before, where we were the fastest growing country in the G7, all the projections for the years thereafter, we are not the lowest growing.
I'll move to reality then.
She asked about inflation, which I think is important. Worth bearing in mind.
Sorry,
if you look
Prime Minister, I've got quite a few questions I need to ask you, and I think it's important to focus on the reality of the people contacting us in Parliament about the realities they face. 1 in 7 are cutting back or going without food because of a lack of money currently. That's 1 in 4 in my region of the North East. What level of food insecurity does the government assess is acceptable in this country?
Of course, we don't want anybody to live in food insecurity.
But that's the reality. So what's the government doing about it?
Prime Minister to answer.
Great. So why don't we? So let me explain the various things that we are doing to help people with the cost of living. So the first and most significant intervention is to support people with their energy bills, because that is the #1 cost increase that they're facing. That support is worth £1,500. It's about half of a typical family's energy bill, and it is benefiting all families up and down the country. I think the second thing is for the most vulnerable families, so the ones that the lady is talking about, the several million of our most vulnerable families, they will receive direct cost of living support through the welfare system. Those payments, £900 for someone who is in receipt of universal credit, additional payments for pensioners or those who are disabled. Then also we're making sure that those on low incomes are benefiting. The national living wage has gone up by record levels
why are
this
people
year.
going hungry?
And then
Prime
particularly,
Minister?
all the money that people are receiving can be used for whatever they deem is most important to them, including food. But the cost of living payments that are going to people can be spent on food. So I think that does help people. And then very specifically on food, what have we done is extend the holiday activity and food programme that's funded hundreds of millions of pounds a year. That provides not just food but also activities to disadvantaged children outside of term time. We have Healthy Start vouchers for expectant, pregnant or new mums that also helps, and of course the Free Schools Meal programme is there. So I think if you put all of that together, whilst I accept of course things are challenging, there are a range of different measures in place to help people with the cost of living, deliberately and specifically targeted on the most vulnerable in our society.
In terms of mortgages, millions are currently terrified about what's going to happen with their mortgage as it comes up for review, and have been ever since the disastrous mini-budget last year of Truss and Kwarteng. Do you know the number of people that are due to remortgage by the end of 2024?
I don't have those numbers to hand, but what I can do, and what would probably be helpful, is to explain to all the people that you're talking about who you said are anxious about that, what support is in place to help them. So a typical mortgage outstanding in the country is about £140,000, or about 17 or so years left. If that mortgage was to reprice now, it would go up from around £770, £800 up to about £1,000. That's a significant increase, of course it is. So what can someone do in that situation? Well, if they extend the term of their mortgage, which they can now do thanks to our mortgage charter, by say 10 years, that will reduce the monthly payments basically back down to where they are currently. They could switch to an interest-only period for a while. That will again reduce the payment by hundreds of pounds. So those are just a couple of things that they can do. So for those who are most vulnerable, then as I said, the support for mortgage interest scheme is there through the welfare system that provides support for people much more quickly than it used to. So those are the practical examples of how someone in the circumstances that you're describing can access support that will actually ease some of the burdens for them, not make them disappear for sure, but considerably ease them.
What about the 15% who are not taking part in the government scheme? There's about 1 million mortgage borrowers affected. What is the government doing about that? Is it really enough to say to the banks, be nice?
No, I said the vast majority of the mortgage market is covered, and the Chancellor is continuing to have those conversations with the 15% that are not, but the vast majority are covered, and that's why, as I've outlined, for someone on a typical mortgage, that support can potentially, or those easements can potentially help offset hundreds of pounds on their monthly mortgage costs when they come to reprice, as well as the support that's there through the welfare system. And again, they can do that without any impact on their credit rating, and because of the consumer duty that the Chancellor has introduced with the FCA, anyone facing fear of repossession will have a full 12 months before that can happen, and the banks have a duty to act fairly and responsibly. So as I said, of course I know it's a worrying time, but there are very specific practical steps that are in place to help people.
Thank you. And moving on to William Ragg on constitutional matters for the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee.
Thank you, Sir Bernard, and good afternoon, Prime Minister. Prime Minister, I hear alarming reports of a blob wandering down Whitehall, thwarting the ambitions of ministers. Do you recognise that characterisation?
No.
So where do you think it comes from?
It doesn't come from me. That my general experience has been in the jobs I've had, whether it's starting out at MHCLG, where I spent much time with Clive, but also in particular at the Treasury over the last few years, and now Number 10, that I've always been supported by incredibly hardworking and diligent civil servants who responded to what I needed and worked all hours, day and night, to deliver what I wanted.
So some current and former ministers, however short-lived they might have been, one night of the realm is described as blobonomics. Do you think this talk is really an excuse for weak ministers and perhaps unworkable policies?
I think ultimately the elected government of the day is responsible for the policies that it is putting forward, and I would expect, and indeed have found in my experience, the civil service to be responsive to implementing them. Of course, that requires strong leadership and direction from ministers in grip over what's happening, and of course things may sometimes feel harder to work through than you would like them to, but as I said, in my personal experience, I haven't found that to be an issue.
And so with your experience, which I accept entirely, do you sometimes take those struggling ministers to one side and perhaps put a friendly arm around their shoulder and perhaps try to inculcate that sense of work ethic in them?
I think everyone is working very hard to deliver for the country, elected and appointed ministers, and also the civil service that works for them. Of course, the last few years have not been easy for anybody, given all the various challenges, pandemic, war in Ukraine, and the demands that's put on the entire system. But I think everyone remains committed to delivering, and I would expect them all to work very hard to do so.
So reports of relations between the government and civil service being at an all-time low are somewhat exaggerated?
Certainly from my perspective, and that's not conducive to delivering for the country, if indeed they were to be that, right? That my view, and has always been, that I've been very fortunate to be served by absolutely brilliant civil servants who have given me everything I've always asked of them and more at all hours of the day. I've been very fortunate and grateful to them for that support. I continue to find that in my current job, and I have no reason to expect that to change. And my general view is that their job is to support government to do it, and we should do that in a constructive attitude, and that's what I'd like to see and expect to happen.
Thank you. Just come on to matters to do with House of Lords appointments, if I may. Could you just briefly explain what you understand to be the conventions around resignation honours, and in particular the nomination of new peers?
So my understanding is that previous Prime Ministers are entitled to resignation honours. They would go through the normal vetting process. I followed what I understand and believe to be the long-standing convention of forwarding those names to the Palace for clearance after they have been through the vetting process, without any active involvement, engagement or interference in that process.
And so you conducted your constitutional role entirely proprietorshly?
Yes, as I said, I had no active involvement or engagement in that process. I received a list and forwarded it on unaltered.
The list that came having been vetted by the House of Lords Appointments Commission?
Absolutely.
And I think there's only one example in the past of that not being the case, is that right? Not with yourself as Prime Minister? I'm
not familiar with that example, but...
Well, I think the example was Lord Truddas, and the next day he gave the party a donation, but they were entirely unrelated, I'm quite sure.
I said, I've whatever list that I've received that has been through the vetting process, I've forwarded on without interference or active involvement in it.
Thank you for clarifying that. Could I ask if you think there's any circumstances under which a resignation honours list is not appropriate?
I said, look, it's a long-standing convention that's been adhered to by, I think, parties of on both sides of the House, and I've fulfilled what I believe to be my constitutional role in following convention and forwarding on a list that I received that had been vetted for approval without interfering and opining on it, and that has generally been the case for political honours more broadly. They're forwarded without the person in charge necessarily agreeing with political honours more generally, and that's how the system has worked.
May I ask if you're still reviewing former Prime Minister Liz Truss's list?
I said that process is ongoing. It hasn't reached me yet.
It hasn't reached you yet. That's helpful. This is entirely hypothetical, as you understand, from my keenness for a Conservative victory at the next general election, so please don't take this the wrong way. But if the eventuality was that you, in circumstances, would you think it appropriate yourself to issue a resignation on his list?
Again, it's not something I'm focused on or have given any thought to.
I think that's a fairly good answer. Thank you, Sir Bernard.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Pete Wishart, Scottish Affairs.
Prime Minister, it's now almost 25 years since the Scotland Act established the Scottish Parliament, and I think it'd be fair to say that relationships between the two governments have never been so poor, characterised as they are by mistrust, suspicion and antagonism. What are you personally doing to try and improve the situation?
Well, I think it's important to try and have a constructive relationship with all the devolved governments in the United Kingdom. Clearly, we're not going to agree on everything, but that doesn't mean. I do think it's important, which is why I think when I first had this job, I spoke, I think, on the first day to the, as it was then, First Minister, not just of Scotland, but of Wales. I was also the first Prime Minister, I think, in over a decade to attend the British-Irish Council that brought together the leaders from across the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. That was warmly received. I met with First Ministers in my role and have done with the new First Minister, and continue to try and find ways to work collaboratively together, for Freeport's being a good example of that, whilst acknowledging it's clearly not that we're going to agree on everything, but it's good to have the dialogue.
Well, that's a very lengthy and important list, but isn't it the case that we now have a situation where the UK routinely ignores Scottish Parliament legislative consent motions? The UK can now legislate in devolved areas. You know, the nuclear option of a Section 35 being used for the first time. The Scottish Government ministers are even being reprimanded for saying Brexit is bad for Scotland when meeting foreign delegations. Do you think this muscular unionism is actually working for you?
No, as I said, I think there are examples of the Scottish Government and UK Government working together, particularly to deliver things like free ports. But you mentioned the Section 35. I think we've had that debate in the past. It was clear that there were concerns about the operation of that law on UK-wide competencies and areas of competence, and it was reasonable in that sense for the Scottish Secretary of State, after taking significant legal advice, to issue the Section 35. And you say, I know that, yes, the first time it's been used, but it was always envisaged. It was always envisaged that it might be used, including, I think, by the SNP at the time. So I don't think people can debate the principle of being used, because it's something that was supported at the time. And again, obviously, it's subject to a legal proceeding now, so there's a limit to how much we can say.
The Scottish Government, but with respect, the Welsh Labour Government recently criticised the UK Government's unilateral and destructive approach to devolution, and is actually seeking to have the UK judicially reviewed. The Northern Irish executive isn't sitting. In Scotland, Wales feels that their democracy is under real threat. Is devolution broken?
Well, again, on Wales, I spoke to the First Minister. I think the first day I got this job, I spent time, I met with him, again, delivering free ports, which are a good example of Wales and Scotland, Wales and the UK government working together. And with regard to Northern Ireland, because you brought it up, I think anyone can say that I haven't been heavily, actively involved in trying to restore the executive in Northern Ireland. I think I visited Northern Ireland almost 5 or 6 times in my first few months in this job. I think I should demonstrate my commitment to Northern Ireland, the people of Northern Ireland, and the Windsor Framework represents, I think, a very significant intervention that removed one of the big barriers to the executive being restored in Northern Ireland.
Given that the UK government's given itself the provisions of the Single Market Act against strong opposition from Scotland and Wales, isn't it the main problem that the UK government represents English interests, while at the same time being the arbiter and referee for the whole of the United Kingdom? And you've now given yourself the powers of the European Union. Surely the 4 nations idea across the UK just isn't working anymore.
No, I think actually, look, the Scottish government, as far as I can recall when I last looked at this, was probably the most powerful devolved assembly anywhere in the world, if not the, certainly one of. Government also delivered all the recommendations in the after 2016. Those have all been delivered. And I think the UK government is right that it looks after UK-wide interests. Now, as I say, sometimes those will conflict, and we've seen that with the Section 35 on the Gender Recognition Act. There's a court process to resolve that, so we should let that
saving Scotland from itself with legislation like
no,
reform,
I think that's because
like
there's
DRS. Is it your job now to be the corrective feature when it comes to devolution issues that you don't like?
No, actually, I mean, on DRS, actually, the drinks industry raised concerns about the Scottish government's
your job was to do that on their behalf,
differing on the rest of the plans for the UK. Now, it's because they had an interaction with UK interests that the UK government was requested for the UKIM exclusion, and actually, as I said, there was an exclusion given on narrow terms, and the decision to not proceed was a decision that was made by the Scottish government.
So it was said to be in the English national interest, therefore it will be judged to be in the UK interest. Is that how it works now? I'm trying to understand how we get to where we are with these. If it's 4 nations, surely all 4 nations should be equal in how these issues are approached.
Well, as I said, the operation of the scheme had an impact on UK-wide interests, and that's why UKIM exclusion was sought, granted on a narrow basis, which would allow the scheme to proceed in a particular way. It was a decision, I think, of the Scottish government ultimately not to proceed with it.
Yeah, because you made it possible for them.
That's not right, actually. I think the chief executive of Circularity Scotland was categorical.
It had nothing to do with you.
I think it was categorical that the scheme remain viable on that basis, and many successful schemes run without glass. So it was the Scottish government that decided not to proceed, and that's a decision that they can explain.
Sir Chris Bryant for the Standards Committee.
Thank you. The Ministerial Code says when Parliament is in session, the most important announcements of government policy should be made in the first instance in Parliament. So why did you announce the NHS workforce plan not in Parliament but outside Parliament?
I've always tried to announce what I can in Parliament. I think my track record, and the Speaker's always said in the past that I particularly have done that. Where that's not possible, or the statement is made immediately there afterwards, particularly in areas...
You announced it last Friday.
I think particularly where it's worth considering that this is not just the government's plan, it's also the NHS's
You could have announced it in Parliament on Monday, couldn't you?
Well, as I said, this involved not just the government, it involved also the NHS. Because it was the NHS's long-term workforce plan. The government was pleased to support it and proud to support it, and it's a plan that will do something special for the NHS in this 75th year.
The Speaker said yesterday the Prime Minister is a Member of Parliament. He is answerable to the Members of Parliament from all political parties. I have to say that his behaviour was not acceptable. He may be the Prime Minister, but the Members of Parliament should hear first. Have you apologised to the House yet?
As I said, I continue to be in Parliament to answer members' questions on a range of issues, making statements on a range of topics, and will continue to do so.
But you're not coming to Prime Minister's questions tomorrow, are you, or next week?
Yes, because I am attending the 75th anniversary celebration for the NHS.
And you decided when that should be, so you could have had it tomorrow evening or tomorrow morning?
No, again, that's not right. I did not decide when that was, and quite frankly, even if it was on a different day, also because His Majesty is in Scotland on Wednesday, it might have been reasonable for me to be there as well. And with regard to the week afterwards, I'm also at the NATO summit.
Remind us when the Prime Minister
I don't know whether is the Honourable Gentleman suggesting that I shouldn't attend the NATO summit on behalf of the United Kingdom, as previous Prime Ministers have done.
Remind us when the Prime Minister last missed 2 Prime Minister's questions in a row.
As I said, I don't know, but
yeah.
as I said, well, I don't know, it's important. Is the Honourable Gentleman suggesting that I don't attend the NATO summit, which I'm not in control of the dates of?
No, I'm suggesting that you should be attending Prime Minister's questions and
not attending the NATO summit.
And you should have made the statement to the House of Commons, because your own ministerial code says that that's what you should do.
So your view is your view is that we should not be attending the NHS celebration or the King's coronation celebration in Scotland, or indeed the NATO summit. I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable point of view. But
let me ask you a different question.
Pointing out the Leader of the Opposition also will be speaking.
We're talking about your turning up in Parliament.
NHS.
We're talking about your respect for Parliament. You didn't turn up for the Owen Paterson votes at all. That's right, isn't it?
I can't recall.
You didn't turn up for the Boris Johnson votes at all, did you?
No, I was at a charity dinner for Jewish care.
I think that's some cutting it fine, I would argue, since other members of Parliament who were at the same dinner with you and left after you did manage to get back for the vote.
I think, with greatest respect, I think their role and my role at the dinner probably slightly different.
You chose not to be there, didn't you? That's twice. On two rule-breaking moments, you chose not to be in Parliament. But yesterday, you opined on the rules of cricket. Take us through that.
I chose to fulfil my obligation to an incredible charity for whom that is one of their significant fundraising moments of the year. My presence there was something that they had asked for, and actually me being there and being able to thank their volunteers and donors was something that they appreciated.
Others were there. Wes Streeting was there as well. He managed to get back.
Again, with the greatest respect, I think his role and my role at that dinner were probably slightly different. I'm very happy to talk about the rules of cricket, as you mentioned.
Yeah, but not about rule breaking in Parliament.
No,
so
that's
my point.
I've also
if I might ask
that
you
too.
about the Privileges Committee then. So the Privileges Committee has accused 7 MPs of trying to undermine and impugn its work. The Leader of the House has condemned this. Do you think that they should apologise to the House?
I haven't actually gone through the report yet, so.
You haven't read the report?
No, I haven't been through the report yet in detail. I've seen it being reported, and I've been very clear in the past that...
But you asked Zach Goldsmith to apologise?
Yes, because he's a
So
minister.
you have read it sufficiently to note that Zach Goldsmith should apologise?
Yes, I've read the findings report. I haven't read the report from cover to cover, no. But I have read the
It's about 3 pages long.
Right, but I've seen the findings.
You know that Zach Goldsmith ought to apologise, but you haven't got an opinion about whether the other 7 should
because there's a
apologise.
difference between Zach Goldsmith's role as a minister, and I think that wasn't consistent with him being a minister, yes.
So you have read the report?
I have not read every page of the report.
Okay.
Sorry, which are you talking about? Which reports? Sorry, anyway.
There are 2 reports. The report that we're considering next week, the one in which it says that the committee thinks that the 7 members of Parliament, all of your political party, were seeking to impugn and undermine the committee report. Let me ask you something else. You have to authorise all foreign travel by trade envoys and other parliamentarians and parliamentary private secretaries. In the last year, that's cost £264,192. Why won't you publish the details of who that's being spent on?
It's not something I'm familiar with the details of past practice on that, but I'll happily look into it.
Okay, different question. Do you think UK businesses should still be trading in Russia at all?
I think UK businesses should be following all the sanctions legislation that we've put in place.
Do you think they should be trading in Russia at all, a year after the second invasion?
There may be particular circumstances in which some businesses are in the process of either divesting or where it's considered that it would actually be detrimental to our interests or hand over assets very cheaply to the Russians. But as I said, the job of business is to comply with the laws that we set.
So Mantrac, which owns Unitrack FZE, sold new diggers to Russia in April of this year, and you took £5 million from its owner. Is that right?
I said
Last question.
I'm not familiar with the specific company.
Philip Dunn, Environmental Audit Committee.
Last time we met at this committee, Prime Minister, you were very keen to pay tribute to the leadership role of the UK on climate and nature issues, and you particularly singled out Lord Goldsmith for his role in delivering the biodiversity deal in Montreal. Are you still as proud of UK leadership on climate and nature in view of Lord Goldsmith's remarks in his resignation letter last week?
Yes, as I said, I'm grateful to him for the work that he did, which helped contribute to that role. But as I said, we should be very proud of our leadership role on tackling climate change, but also putting nature at the heart of how we do so.
So the ambition for net zero remains, but delivery over the past year and under your Prime Ministership has slowed, and the evidence for that is the Committee on Climate Change's report last week, in which Lord Deben said in his finale, in his forward to that annual report, that our confidence in achieving the UK's 2030 target of the 5th and 6th carbon budgets has markedly declined from last year through lack of apparent delivery by officials, taking a signal that this has not been your priority as Prime Minister.
I'd say, look, I disagree with what Zach Goldsmith said. I think our record is
that was Lord Deben.
Yes, no, but just go more broadly our record on this. And I mean, the facts are that we've decarbonised faster than any other G7 country. Right? Those are the facts. The facts are that when we were presidents of COP, we ensured a very successful COP that had a clear trajectory to 1.5, made sure that we increased the number of countries that had binding targets on net zero. We've protected land degradation, forests, coal financing. There's a range of things that we have led on. And with regard to the carbon budget, again, the facts are that we have overachieved on every single one of our carbon budgets to date. We are on track to have met the third. That's what the latest statistics show. And I think the Committee for Climate Change said that their confidence in the UK meeting the fourth carbon budget has actually slightly increased in the last year. Look, with regard to 2033, then 2037, which is when some of these future carbon budgets are, of course, we've already set out that some of those policies will evolve over time. It's hard to predict right now with certainty the exact shape of the UK economy in 2037, but we've done a better job of this than anybody else. We have the most ambitious targets compared to anybody else, so I feel nothing but proud and confident in our record.
Do you expect the British government to respond to both the US and the EU significant interventions that have happened this year before the COP28 meeting in November?
Sorry, Philip, what was the question?
So we've had the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, we've had significant measures in the EU.
I think, look, it's right that other places are catching up with us, right? I mean, that's the reality of it. We have decarbonised faster than any of those other blocks. So other countries are having to catch up, which is a good thing, which we welcome, right? That will help combat climate change. And I'm glad that they're doing so. And we do this in a completely different way. Historically, we've done it through things like contracts for difference and other things, which have brought tens of billions of pounds of investment into the sector. And if you look at that over time, and you actually compare as a percentage of GDP what we've done, what the US has done, we've consistently out-invested and will continue to do so. It's just that people do it in different ways, and I think you need to compare on an apples-to-apples basis. And again, one of the ways in which, and our contracts for difference structure is now being copied all around the world, and that is a different way to bring investment into the green transition. But also one on the R&D side, we've protected our R&D budget, it's growing. That's ultimately how we can also contribute, because if we can develop the technologies that will help us deal with these things and then commercialise them, that will do enormous good for the world, and that's something that plays to our strengths as a country. So
looking forward to COP28, do you plan to prioritise UK leadership? And if so, how are you going to demonstrate that?
Yes, I mean, again, I attended COP as Chancellor and we had a very successful finance day. I think it was widely perceived to be the most successful finance day that COP had ever had. And the centrality of that made sure that we would be the first net zero financial centre, and all the things around TCFD disclosures and other things which we've pioneered. That's what I did as Chancellor. I attended last year. We talked about nature in particular last year, and that carried on at Montreal. And we will continue to do that this year as well. And I think part of the focus this year will be on attracting private capital to help with the transition. That's something, given our strength in financial services, is an area where I think we can obviously play a leading role in.
Thank you.
Thank you. And moving on to Robin Walker, Education Committee.
Thanks, Mohammed. You've referred, Prime Minister, to education as the closest thing to a silver bullet that we have. You also said at PMQs recently that children missing school is a tragedy. So how concerned are you with the latest figures that show that 24.2% of pupils were persistently absent in the autumn term, almost double the rate of the previous year?
I think the first thing is it's welcome that the number of pupils who are persistently absent in school fell by I think over 300,000 spring term 2022 to the year before. But you're right that persistent absence is a real challenge. The tools for responding to it, resolving it, don't just lie with the Department for Education as well. So one of the things we're doing is rolling out attendance hubs across around 600 different primary and secondary schools to spread best practice. That will reach, I think, about 250,000 children. And the work they do includes activities like automatic text messages, using data to analyse proactively who might be at risk, those types of things. There's some other things I can talk to, but look, it's a real challenge, and it's right that we focus on it.
In terms of addressing this challenge, one solution which the government previously drafted legislation for was a statutory register for children not in school. That's been supported by the Children's Commissioner, the Select Committee, the opposition front bench, I think, in PMQs recently. And it's something we have legislation before the House from my colleague on the committee, Flick Drummond, to address that. Is that something that you feel the government could embrace and deliver?
Look, we remain committed to introducing a statutory local authority register for children, as well as actually a duty for local authorities to provide support to home educating families. We will look to legislate at a suitable opportunity to do so, but obviously, again, without preempting full session legislation.
Since we last met, the Chancellor has made very welcome announcements in terms of childcare and stepping up the activity of the government in that respect, providing support to parents of under 3-year-olds. That will mean a shift from the government subsidising about 50% of the childcare market to around 80%. Do you recognise that puts an additional burden of responsibility on ministers and the government to make sure that it's adequately funded so that settings can keep going?
Yes, just first thing to say is that a member of my family has a financial interest in a childcare company, but as well as the expansion that the Chancellor announced in the provision extending the age entitlement, significant funding was put in to deal with the existing entitlement to meet inflationary pressures. It was around 200 million in this year, paid from this September, and then rising to just shy of 300 million for the future year, with further uplifts to come. What does that mean? It means a 30% increase in the 2-year-old rate, which will take it to around £8 an hour, but also an inflationary increase to the other rates as well.
And some of those rates, I think, have been welcomed in theory by some of the practitioners we spoke to, but there is a question mark over whether they will actually receive them, given some of the machinery of local government through which the rates have to pass. Will you be encouraging ministers to ensure that they do receive the rate at or close to the national rate that's been advertised?
Yes, I mean, the rates were chosen in response to surveys with, I think, thousands of nurseries to understand the different cost structure for provision. They're adjusted in local areas to account for local differences. I will go back and make sure that the money is flowing as it is intended to, but it has been certainly been announced and put aside.
And just lastly on this area, one of the great benefits of early education is early identification of need. And in terms of SEND, picking up issues early on, being able to address them early on, it allows children to engage with their education in mainstream schools, who might otherwise end up in much more expensive and more limiting specialist placements. However, our committee's heard that only 18% of local authorities feel they have enough provision for disabled children in the early years. Is there anything specific that you think should be done to address that as part of the wider efforts of the government in SEND?
I'd say the SEND and Alternative Provision Improvement Plan that we published in March, I think, of this year, just sets out the government's mission for SEND and alternative provision, making sure that it can fulfil, or we can collectively fulfil children's potential and have trust of parents in the system and financial sustainability. And alongside that, we're increasing the high needs funding by about £10 billion for this financial year, which is 10% increase over last year's funding, so that should help.
And moving further up the school system, there's been a lot of concern about transparency on schools' teaching of RSHE materials, and how do you strike the right balance between reassuring parents and making sure that they can have access to these materials and making sure that children do have access to the curriculum that the Conservative government introduced?
Yeah, look, my personal view is it's vital that what children are taught in RSHE is age appropriate and factual. I was concerned by reports that wasn't the case, as was the Education Secretary. That's why we brought forward a review of the RHSE statutory guidance. We've assembled an expert independent panel who are drawing on different backgrounds: health, education, equalities, children development, safeguarding, to help inform our work. Their work should conclude in September, and their recommendations will help us form a public consultation for later in the autumn. So that's our approach to that. With regard to materials for parents, I think we've been very clear. Parents should be able to see all resources, and I don't think...
And ministers have repeatedly stated from the dispatch box that parents should be able to see. I think courts have ruled otherwise. If there is a legal issue here, would legislation be a possibility to address it?
I said we're working through that as we speak, but our general view is that copyright law does not prevent a parent from viewing external resources. We've written to schools to clarify our expectations, but as I said, that's the review and the guidance will work through that particular issue. But our current position is that copyright law shouldn't prohibit that from happening.
Great. Thank you. And finally, Steve Bryan from the Health and Social Care Committee.
Thank you, Chair. Prime Minister, well done. Well done on getting the NHS long-term workforce plan out. It's a serious piece of work, and it's a big moment. And well done for taking the long view, because clearly a 15-year plan outlives even the next Parliament when you're Prime Minister. Can I ask you about medical school training places? It says in the plan that the first new medical school places will be available from September 25. Now, presumably that's about the public expenditure cycle. But we've heard from colleagues in medical schools who are in a position now to make offers for September 24 to domestic students who want to be doctors in England. If there were funded places available now. The UCAS deadline for September next year is the 15th of October this year. Is there a reason why we're kicking in September 25?
Well, it's not just the medical training places. My understanding of it is we need to make sure that the pipeline can also deal with the other training that people will need, not just in the medical schools, and the system needs to be able to deliver that at the same time. But also, as one of the things we talked about is we're looking at the medical school training itself and looking at whether there are ways to improve the efficiency and streamline that process. And we want to make sure we do that work, because if there's a way to fund medical school training places that are done in a more efficient or effective way, we'd like to do that. So that work needs to happen as well. And I think that will take some time, because that will obviously involve the medical regulators to look at potential different ways of training students and making sure that they're okay with it if we can do the training in a slightly shorter period of time whilst obviously maintaining the quality. That would be beneficial, and if we want to put incremental funding into that ideally, so we need time for that process to play out.
There's a lot of announcements in the plan. I mean, I think you could have filled your number 10 grid for many, many weeks hence with the number of things that are in here. One of which was talking about, with respect to training dentists, a tie-in period to encourage dentists to spend a minimum proportion of their time delivering NHS care in the years following graduation. Could you tell us how long that could potentially be in your mind, and was that discussed in political circles for doctors more widely?
Yeah, I think I addressed this at the press conference. I think people have raised concerns both on the medical side and the dentistry side. The work was done on the medical side, and I think I said that I haven't got the numbers to hand, but I think around 95-ish% of people who had done medical training after a certain period of time were still in NHS practice. So the issue was, I think, far less widespread than most people assumed it to be, which was why it didn't seem like right now it was necessary. The issue on dentistry was more pervasive, where I think, as I said, I don't have it to hand, but around, I think, only 2/3 of those who had trained at some point later were doing providing NHS services. That's obviously a far more significant issue, and that's after the receipt of hundreds of £1,000s of taxpayer support during training. So it did seem reasonable to explore options for a tie there. But as I said, no conclusions, but that seems to be something that is worth exploring for dentistry. At this stage, the issue in medicine seems to be less pervasive than imagined.
So just sticking briefly with teeth, because you'll know there's huge concern among our constituents about access to NHS dentistry. There is talk of an NHS dentistry plan from the department, presuming that you wanted to get the workforce plan out first. Could you give any update to constituents as to when they might see that?
I don't have an update, but I can tell you that we're still getting on, and there's more money that's been put into dentistry. There's been some reform and changes to the existing dentistry contract, and high-performing practices are able to provide, I think, about 10% more activity, which should also help, and the number of dentists higher now than it was before, or the last set of numbers that I've seen.
But not necessarily doing NHS work, of course, that's the challenge.
Sorry?
Not necessarily doing NHS work.
But I said that's why the workforce plan not only trains more dentists, but also is exploring the type.
All right.
But the reforms to the contract should hopefully increase NHS.
Just finally, the plan says on page 13, rising demographic pressures and changing burden of disease are increasing demand for NHS services. Well, yeah, and some. I mean, demand continues to outstrip supply with an ageing population. And I just wonder, where are you on the prevention agenda, Prime Minister? Because it has to be better than cure. You know, when you see that we've kicked the buy one, get one free regulations down the line, the advertising restrictions for food, high fat, salt, sugar, that's been pushed down the line. Where are you personally on the prevention of ill health?
No, of course, prevention is always better than a cure. I think it's worth being cognizant of the particular challenges with inflation and the cost of living that we face at the moment, and I think it's reasonable to course correct for that. But more generally, you can see that calorie labelling on menus, for example, is a good example of that. And then if you look at the provision most recently of anti-obesity medicines, that should help, because we know there's a link there between other conditions like heart disease and diabetes. But then also on smoking, where the Switch to Stop programme again is trying to act proactively and I think quite innovatively, and the Chief Medical Officer here would be able to talk to you about it better than I can, but there's such persuasive evidence that programme, or the schemes that we've done on a smaller scale, if you can help people switch away from smoking to using vapes. This is not disposable vapes for children, which is obviously concerning, and I've spoken about that in the past, but for existing adult smokers to switch, there are clear public health benefits of that before bigger problems come down the line. So those are some examples of the things we're doing in the prevention space.
And thank you for getting the plan out. Chair.
Thank you. Well, we've done it extremely well, and we're going to finish it even a little early, partly because I've foregone my own questions to a large extent. But could I just ask Sir Chris Bryant, who has volunteered to correct the record very neatly?
Yes, many apologies. I said that Wes Streeting had voted on the 19th of June, and I was wrong, so I just want to put the record straight. Apologies to the committee.
Thank you very much indeed. Prime Minister, thank you for your attendance today. Maybe we can have an extra 10 minutes or so next time. But I'm most grateful to you for attending.
Thank you very much.
Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.